All right, let's get right into what this class is going to be all about, which is essentially biodiversity. And very two words I'm sure you've heard before: biology, which just means life, and we all know what it means to be diverse. You have many different, in this case, the background picture, many different flowers, many different types of vegetation. So diversity is just looking at the amount of different types of individuals. So that the goals of this lecture, we're going to look at again how we're going to define biodiversity and why it's important not only to you and I, but all living things on Earth. And then we're going to look at the unique relationships in nature. So let's get going here. So biodiversity, there's two categories. You can have genetic or you can have ecological. And genetic biodiversity is just looking at all the different genes involved. And then looking at this picture here, those are all dogs. But just by looking at them, the color, the size, the stature, their ears, all of that, those are all different genes being expressed. So when we look at genetic biodiversity, we're looking at the actual genetic makeup of individuals. Whereas ecological diversity, we are looking at all different populations in a given area. And this includes terrestrial and aquatic. And that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to see also that the ecological diversity of an area will affect the genetic diversity, so they go hand in hand. And one of the underlying topics that we're going to see throughout this class is that we're going to look at the threats to biodiversity, because again, the goal is to see why biodiversity is so important to you and I, and then we're going to look at the threats in order to see how we can prevent these things from happening. So moving on, let's look at carrying carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is exactly what it sounds like. Think of a backpack. You can put so many things in a backpack, and that's its capacity. And even carrying capacity is, we can take this and view as looking at this, the amount of people on this truck. I don't think you could put one more person on that truck. We would say it has reached carrying capacity. So keep that in mind as we look at populations and even the Earth as a whole in regards to carrying capacity. And we all know all living things need certain things to survive: food, space, air, clean water. I should have said clean air. And as long as those things are available, the population will succeed. Unfortunately, as those resources diminish or as population increases, there's not going to be enough for all individuals to survive. So that's what we mean by carrying capacity. You can look at this graph. Let's say this is the amount, this dotted line is the carrying capacity. This is how many individuals this ecosystem can hold. And once a population, in the example we had was this fishbowl, once the amount of fish overshoots the carrying capacity, we're going to see a die-off and the population is going to go down. And once we see that, normally after the die-off, we usually see the population level out and basically cap itself at carrying capacity. Let's look at Earth's carrying capacity, and this is the human population. So it is believed we can have a certain amount of, a little about 3.5 billion people, given all the resources that are on Earth. And as the human population continues to rise, especially since the Industrial Revolution, we have overshot that carrying capacity. And again, just like what we've seen with other individuals, other organisms that overshoot their carrying capacity, we can expect to die off unless something is done. So that's where we're at today. So we have our Earth, we have all of our resources, but unfortunately, this human population is growing at this exponential rate. But not to get too bummed out, that's the whole goal of this course. We're going to learn how we can have this many people and how to live that word sustainably. You're going to hear that quite a bit. So what is a population? A population is just a group of individuals. You can see a population of giant tortoises here. A population is specific to one species. And there's things that are going to limit a population. The type of environment, is it too hot? Is it dangerous? These would be called physical limitations. Are there competitions among other organisms with food? Or you could even have competitions among the same organisms with food. And are there geographic limitations? Is there a mountain or an ocean that this organism, this species can't cross or get by that limits the number of individuals in that area? So again, keeping that carrying capacity in mind, along with the limiting factors of population, all these things are going to determine carrying capacity. Moving on, we're going to close off with succession. So what we have here is, think of a disruption. A volcanic eruption would be a perfect example. A volcano erupts, all life is wiped out, and all you are left with is rocky soil. So that's a pioneer species. Thinking back, pioneers were the first people to arrive to an area. A pioneer species is going to be that first species, usually it's lichen or small plants, that show up on this rocky, bare crust and start to form the process of life. And here we can see a succession going on, and this takes at times many, many years. As soil develops, you'll start to see larger shrubs, bushes begin to grow, and then eventually we reach this climax community. That's where we usually find our healthy ecosystem with many different individuals, lots of biodiversity. And this can even happen in a lake or pond ecosystem as well. You can have this just empty pond filled with water, and as succession goes on, sediment fills in, allowing plants to grow. We start to see fish show up, and again, this will go on even to a climax community where you'll see a forest, where eventually the pond has the water has left, and we're left with this climax community of forest. So what is a community now? We talked about a population as an individual species. A community is a group of populations living together, and this includes your animal species as well as your plant species. So again, you can see here, as succession takes place, usually we have our plant species show up, but then eventually they allow a successful ecosystem for animals to thrive as well. Secondary succession I want to point out is, notice in primary we were left with just bare rock. We use the example of a volcanic eruption. Secondary succession is more like maybe a forest fire or farmland that is no longer tilled that the farmer left. So there's already life in place, and usually there's just, again, flowers or grasses, but when left unattended by man, we start to see this progression of life take place, and then again developing into that climax community. Here's a great example of the Mount St. Helens succession. 17 years later, you had the volcano wipe out an entire area of the forest, and we can see on the right-hand picture it's slowly starting to come back.